Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the shows list at harbingermedianetwork.com. The strike on Friday, November the 4th and Monday, November the 7th, 2022, of 55,000 education workers in Ontario belonging to the 67 locals of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, grouped as the Ontario School Boards Council of Unions, or OSBCU, who were joined by several thousand education workers who belonged to the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, was a very important struggle. Arguably, this was the most important strike in so-called Canada since the Hospital Employees Union strike in British Columbia in 2004. Joining me to discuss the strike is Peter Hogarth, a teacher in Ontario and author of an article, Who Killed Bill 28? Ontario Workers and the Threat of a General Strike, the link for which will be in the show notes for this episode, along with links to a couple of other relevant articles. I should just also mention that in the episode, in the conversation with Peter, I did misspeak slightly about the dates of the strike, but the correct dates were, in fact, November 4th and 7th. So, Peter, thanks for joining me on Victor's Children.
Thanks for having me. That's fun.
So, could you start by telling listeners, many of whom are not in Ontario, who the workers who went on strike are and what the key issues were in their efforts to bargain a new collective agreement?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we're talking about who is represented or who were these workers, it would be kind of, in many ways, like a simple way to say it would be everyone but teachers, kind of. But of course, that varies by school board that you're in. But we can say that for the most part, these were workers that were, custodial services, building maintenance services, educational assistants, many early childhood educators in kindergarten classes and stuff like that, like clerical and I guess you would call it, or an office administrative type stuff. And then also some people that worked in like the library resources and like technology, like IT departments. And so it covered a large group of workers in various capacities that were not teachers, many in the class, but all of them are essential to, making schools safe and successful for students.
Great. And in terms of the key issues in this round of bargaining, what were they?
Well, it seemed like the issues that most motivated the members, and this was done based on, I think, well, first of all, we should say that the OSBCU definitely, since 2019, as Laura Walton said, had been trying to really employ like a member-to-member grassroots communication process where they could really get people, involved and have them expressing what issues were most important to them. And one that was really animating and the one that sort of was most obvious to the public would be the one of pay, because effectively for like, I guess the last, maybe decade, they'd essentially experienced what would be called like, an 11% cut in wages, like in real terms, based on inflation and stuff like that. Because their wages had been capped and they'd received very small wage increases over the last several contracts. So wage increases were very big, and specifically the demand that became popularized was $3.25 an hour for all the members. And they were specifically trying to avoid like percentage-based increases because that would increase the inequity or the pay disparity between the highest paid members and the lowest paid members in the bargaining group. So that was one big one. And then others that were important were trying to secure language around maintaining, like, for instance, services in terms of, like hiring office staff, making sure that every kindergarten class had an ECE, ensuring that there were more EAs available to do work, and then as well things around, making sure that cleaning happened every day and stuff like that, and avoiding contracting out, and and then also maintaining benefits funding, and what's the other thing called? And sick leave and stuff like that. So those were the main issues from what I understand. And of course, the one that I think motivated members the most was wages. And that's obvious to people that are in schools, because we know many people that we work with in that job category are often, leaving school to go work another job on the evenings or weekends.
Okay, thanks for that. So could you talk a little bit more? You touched on this, but could you talk a little bit more about how the leaders of the OSBCU prepared for the strike that ultimately happened?
From what I understand, based on like what Laura Walton said, and in Spring Magazine, we did an interview with her that shed some light on this. They got a lot of inspiration from the New Brunswick education workers strike. I guess that was just before 2019. I can't remember for sure, but that was a strike against a conservative government that did win a lot. And I think members of OSBCU were out there and got to witness that and sort of took a lot from that. And I think there was also a bit of that, like a lot of people I know in education circles and education union circles were reading that book, No Shortcuts, I think it's called, and some of those other Jane McAlevey books. And those were inspirations too, I think, as far as what they wanted to achieve in terms of like member-driven unionism, you know what I mean? Kind of going against the same old that we're probably familiar with, where, someone on high says such and such, and you either go, oh, good, or go, oh, darn, and that's the end of it. And so it seemed like a real dive into locals to try and get people activated there, and a lot of like surveys and communication and opportunities to talk to members about what their experience was like on the job and what they were willing or, ready to fight for. And that resulted, I think, in, the demands and the confidence that you saw in sort of like, the 39,000 is not enough campaign that was launched, far ahead of when the contract expired, and sort of a confidence that came from, really clearly articulating like who we are, like we want to represent who we are to the public, what we do, and, the conditions of our work and how they could be better. And by making them better, you'd improve the learning conditions for the whole province. And I guess making the case that like this is a fight for actually this, the soul of public education in Ontario. What do we want? Do we want it understaffed, precarious, and on call and maybe not filled in, or do we want something really robust that is actually meeting the needs of students? And I guess maybe that's a slight diversion from what you're asking, but from what I can tell, based on interactions with members from different locals, it sounded like that approach really led to lots more engagement. And I think we saw that, and this might be anticipating a future question, but we really saw that in the turnout and the strike vote that happened on, I guess it was, when was it? Early October. That was a real indicator of how involved and tapped in the membership was into the demands and the strike and all that type of stuff. So that was really exciting. And I think a reflection of that kind of, what do they call it? People often call it like deep organizing or something like that. But really that attempt to get into the members and talk to them in a meaningful way where they can actually see themselves reflected in bargaining.
Right. So an extremely high turnout and an extremely high vote, above all, to authorize a strike. And so that was being done inside the union. Oh, and I should just mention, for any listeners who don't know, that Laura Walton is the president of the OSBCU, since that name has come up. So that's inside the union. What about outside the union? What was being done by people to build support for the union?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, this is an area I feel like I can speak on quite well, because I've only been teaching in the public school board for the last couple of years, but before that I was involved with, and I still am, Justice for Workers, and what was called before that Fight for 15 and Fairness, which if we think about it from like, the last few years, because you got to step back and it's like, obviously decades are happening in weeks here, but in this case, the last few years when we had a pandemic and that turned to lockdowns and stuff like that, that was kind of, of course, that could have meant, I don't know, it could have been really bad for organizing and like the lead up to this moment, right? When, people are sort of atomized and in their homes and not able to do the things they usually do. And so I was really grateful. And I think we're lucky that the Justice for Workers campaign kept with quite frequent organizing online, like in a virtual space, trying to see what could be done safely amidst, this global pandemic, where we could still push on things like decent wages, like liability for employers for workplace accidents, paid sick days, obviously being an important one in that moment. And because we kept meeting online frequently, and those were all, we started doing these joint meetings with the OFL. That was a really cool place where not only were we maintaining that type of organizing, but building this sort of, being a place where people could plug in to issues around labor and safety at work and stuff like that. And by doing that, it was an opportunity to create sort of, or strengthen sort of, not in the traditional sense we might want or hope, but like a sort of rank and file worker network that involved, unionized and non-unionized workers, talking about these issues, going into breakout groups around things like employment insurance, safety on the job, which had a lot of education workers in it, and then talking about childcare, which was an opportunity to link up with, ECs and stuff like that were maybe outside the public board or inside the public board, and creating an opportunity where we could kind of make some of these connections, as best you could across the province, which put us in a good position for when this kind of opportunity came up. Recognizing that, we've been meeting a lot. We're talking about safety. We're talking about decent work. This is a really important struggle. The education workers struggle is a really important struggle in the battle for decent work. And because we'd been meeting regularly and had practice of for instance, going into our communities and doing things like putting up posters, talking to people on street corners about, decent work issues, safety at work, paid sick days, etc. It made us, we had sort of the bones or the networks to be able to, when, they take the strike vote, we go, we've got to paint this province purple in solidarity, right? And what does that mean? We had, all of us were, actually, it was funny because at first it's like, is anyone going to pick up this call? Like, will people, when we put out the call, like, hey, does anyone want to put up posters in support of education workers? Who needs materials? Like, maybe one or two came. All of a sudden, overwhelmed with requests for posters and stuff like that. And then because you have people in all these different neighborhoods and cities and towns across the province, it's easy to go, okay, we'll send you some posters, or you print some out, put them around your school, and then in the lead up to, post strike vote, let's get out there and be at, drop off or pick up of these schools and talk to parents about what's going on, sign them up, on a pledge to say, I will show solidarity to such and such workers, to the striking CUPE workers. And that put us in a real good spot to be able to spread that solidarity. And those posters that were created ended up being used in every staff room, right? There's some schools that I work in regularly and others that I fill in for. And every staff room I'd go to had those kind of purple, we support education workers posters. And it became a way to, it was by acting quickly, you could by anticipating what the fault lines would be and acting quickly, it armed people to be able to express solidarity and then win over other people that might have been on the fence, and give those people that were, solid in terms of, union solidarity, give them the stuff they needed to be able to win over other people and make it easy to get on board. And then you started having these solidarity selfies, with, people that were teachers or education workers being like, I'm going to take my school and we're going to get a selfie and we're going to send it in and say we support, and just many different ways to be able to show that solidarity, that which then, we saw reflected in high public support for the strike, or for the bargaining and then eventual strike.
All right. So that's given people, I think, a good sense of what was happening inside and outside the union. Let's talk about the other side. What stance did the Tory government, provincial government of Doug Ford take when it came to bargaining with education workers?
Oh, yes. Well, they had been very publicly bargaining in extremely bad faith throughout, or sorry, bargaining in public, but not bargaining at the table over the summer when, for instance, OSBCU had really like made the case that like, wow, we want to really get this bargaining done before our contract expires and before school starts because we do not want to have any interruptions in learning. Well, of course, the Tories throughout the summer kept doing the whole thing where it's like, oh, you greedy teachers again. It's these greedy teachers, like, completely trying to obscure who the actual workers are, what they were demanding, and then trying to, do the classic, like, these are sunshineless teachers that just want, what XYZ, and we shouldn't take them seriously. They're going to bankrupt the province, etc. You know what I mean? Just really bad faith stuff over the whole summer until the very last minute. And then they start bargaining after the contract expires. And then again, saying one thing in public around, the generous offers they're making. And then in reality, stalling at the bargaining table, offering, pennies compared to what they're asking. They try to do a two-tiered thing to kind of split the lower wage workers from the higher wage, offering, I think it was 2.5 or something, 2.5%, I think, to those making under 40K, and then 1.5 to those making over 40K. And actually, from what I can tell, taking some shots at benefits and paid sick leave and stuff like that, basically forcing the workers to have to, take a strike vote and go on strike. And then after all that stalling and stuff like that, as they had been throughout the whole thing, like, oh, our number one thing is we don't want to disrupt school. We just want kids in school. Became this sort of hollow phrase where it's like, well, you want kids in school, but do you want anybody in there? Like, what happens in the school? It's clear that you don't really care about what happens in the school. You just want them in there. And that was, I think, on full display, especially at the beginning when you could see, when you had this robust public support and people were really questioning him. It was nice to see that every time Stephen Lecce posted something on Twitter, there'd just be this wild ratio of, hundreds of people interrogating, what he's saying and asking about what's going on and stuff like that. To the point, so with all that, and then just stalling at the table, eventually to the point where OSBCU, after this huge strike vote, as you said, 84% turnout, 96% voting in favor of a strike, said, well, we're putting our 5 days notice in where we will strike if you don't meet us anywhere on these demands, right? Like, it's quite clear that you're not serious at all. Well, as soon as that happened, then the Tories, I think, obviously wrongfully assuming what would happen and that they'd have the public on their side with these greedy public sector unions that want to, sabotage the kids' futures. Obviously, I'm speaking sarcastically here, that they would support the next keeping, what is it called? I think it was Bill 28, Keeping Students in School Act or something like that. So obviously, like, just the most ridiculous title for the most ridiculous bill, which essentially made criminal their right to strike, would force a contract through on them. The one, it's like, you're gonna take the one we offer, and you're not allowed to strike about it. And here's Section 33, I think it's called, the notwithstanding clause, so that you can't do anything about it and you can't challenge it. So they seemed really confident. They had these 5 a.m. sessions where they could all get up at the crack of dawn to come in and vote this thing. They were laughing, backslapping, having a good old time. Well, they faced immediate backlash for that because it seemed quite clear to the public that this was an absolutely overstepping boundaries, completely trampling on their democratic right to collectively bargain. It felt like, even if you didn't have that exact idea or that language, it felt like really nasty bullying. And especially when the union had quite clearly made this case that these are some of the lowest paid workers in the school system. And the other thing is, like, if you're looking, for a highly racialized and like quite predominantly workforce predominantly made up of women, this is that. And so it had that extra added layer of real nasty bullying to it. And they faced immediate backlash for it. The OFL, luckily, people could sense this type of thing, right? And the OFL could see, obviously this is like a threat to unions in general, right? And they organized quite quickly a like a night of action where people could come out, and you had a few thousand people come out to the Ministry of Labor and, shout and come together there, marched over to Queen's Park. And it was the case where it's like, holy cow, like this is really something. People are very, very angry. The next night, I know Justice for Workers had a phone zap sort of thing where we called, just about every conservative politician, and there was like 600 people out to it. The next night there was a parents' action outside the Sheraton, I guess, where they were doing their bargaining, and there was hundreds of parents there, and you could see the anger from all different sectors of the union. Anyway, I might have just jumped ahead, but it was quite clear that Doug Ford and the Tories, really overstepped with their reaction after being so nasty the whole time. And then there was immediate backlash from the public.
Right. So this very heavy-handed piece of legislation with the invocation of the clause in the Constitution, which would protect the legislation against an illegal challenge, the notwithstanding clause, which made it a generalized threat to unions. This hasn't been done before, the invocation of that clause in this kind of context. So we then saw the workers defy this legislation and go on strike on the 5th of November. And they had a very large amount of public support. I think you've done a good job of explaining why that was the case. It's interesting, there was an article, again, it'll be linked in the show notes for anybody who hasn't seen it, published in The Breach by Martin Lukacs and Emma Paling, which in the course of their investigative journalism, they bring up that apparently there was pressure from top officials of CUPE National on the OSBCU not to go on strike. But despite that additional internal pressure, the strike began on the 5th of November. And it's interesting, one Ontario government official was quoted on CTV News saying, "We didn't really think they'll just say we'll strike illegally. We just didn't take that into account." So whether that's true or not, certainly it appears that the government was caught off guard by the determination of the union leadership in this case, and of course by the very strong support of members and other people. Could you talk about how things began to unfold then once the picket lines went up on the 5th of November?
Yeah, for sure. And I should talk about a little bit, I should just say the mention sort of the week ahead too. As soon as the legislation was introduced, you could hear rumblings everywhere. Of course, I'm trying to be as involved in all this stuff as I can. And you could see on every different sort of, teacher and education worker discussion board, people arguing about what needs to be done. How can people show support? You had teachers getting, really outraged, like, how are they trying to make us, and in every staff room, people talking about, are they like, are we going to be crossing a picket line if we do this? I won't do that. And, this, what can be done? Who can we do? And then people having, people doing their best to have conversations to really get on the phone or the email or whatever to their local union reps and stuff like that and demand, like, we need to be in solidarity here. We need to do something. And it seems like they got tons of pressure from that. And it was interesting too, because I remember it was like, I think it was Halloween when that sort of came out, and already I was out, trick-or-treating with my kids, and one of their friends' parents was an electrician, and she started talking about, oh geez, like, I know what happened to our union with a no strike clause, and that it hasn't been good for us, and this is awful what the government's doing. And then I started hearing from other friends in different unions, construction unions and stuff like that, talking about, well, our leadership says we might have to do something about this. You know what I mean? And you could really get the sense that people were feeling the pressure, both the leadership itself, of course, because this is again a threat to like their very existence, right? If the government can do this to education workers, well, why can't they do that to the rest of us? And you got the sense that there was lots of pressure, especially from people that are like, tapped in and thinking about this type of stuff, that they were really getting active and trying to activate, people around them to like, hey, can you send an email here? Can you talk about this at our union meeting? Can you do this? You know what I mean? What can we do to support? And that stuff started to really steamroll. And I think the leadership felt that pressure about their very existence. And they also felt the pressure from the members that we have to be seen to be doing something here. Otherwise, what is the point of being a union or whatever? You know what I mean? And it was exciting. I guess I should say the BC Federation of Teachers, they had some meeting and they voted to donate $1 million to the fund. And you got the sense that, in schools, of course, you talk to people that are in these jobs and they're worried, right? And scared. And and people aren't used to feeling strong and powerful. People aren't used to feeling very strong and powerful, right? Like, I'm just one, janitor at this school. What do I do? But all of a sudden, when you, like, of course, when you went down to, let's say, Queen's Park on the day, you had tons and tons of people that were starting to really feel their power, right? And being like, holy cow, this is something. Like, there's thousands and thousands of us. We're out here. We're proudly saying on our signs, like, what I do. You know what I mean? You could see people grabbing pens and writing down, like, I'm a, custodian. I'm a speech language person. I do, ESL stuff. I'm an ECE, and like wearing that on their chest and marching in front of Queen's Park in this place that just voted to like not care about them in any way. Starting to feel that power and feel like an indignity around like what the government had done and demonstrating that strength. And I think like when Laura Walton goes on the news and says, well, we're going to strike. Who cares? You know what I mean? Like, we will strike. So they say we can't. Well, we're going to. You know what I mean? We're going on a day of political protest or whatever you call it. And that was a real wild thing. Everyone I know that's like even like remotely political, because we have all these conversations, it's calling and talking about, oh, is this going to be a general strike? We have to have a general strike. Are we going to have a general strike? What do we do? And I could see people in my little orbit that are, teachers and stuff like that. And going from being like, oh, geez, I hope, like 2 weeks ago, being like, oh, geez, I hope nothing happens. Like, I don't want, I don't want any disruption, but what do I do without my, ECE and stuff like that, to going like, this government has gone too far and this is awful. Like, I will not do a single day of class without an ECE in my class, you know what I mean? Or without my EA or whatever. And the funny thing too, is that many teachers too were spurred to even more solidarity because it's like, online learning, I hate it. We got to win this thing. We're not going to do that. You know what I mean? I've had enough of that. So all these different things coming together to make people really go on side, and even people that weren't, because of course, everywhere you go in every workplace, there's people that are like, oh, are they asking for too much? Oh, this is not good for the province. That, you know what I mean? Have those people, at least though it was the kind of momentum where those people felt less confident to be making those arguments because the force of nature was sort of on the other side and was at least sympathetic, if not outright solidaristic or whatever, towards the struggle. And in general, being like, well, this is an existential threat to my livelihood as a XYZ, whatever it is, could be a plumber, could be a teacher, whatever. If they take away this right to, this right to strike, especially with so many other education units set to that are bargaining this year too, right? So it's even more prescient. So there's that kind of vibe, and then and so you just had people feeling powerful, and feeling confident because especially they'd said we're on your side, and then you had like. So much to talk about. Geez. But and then you had that really great move by OPSU saying, hey, if any education, if people, we encourage you to walk out today in solidarity, OPSU workers, we'll have your back with fines and stuff like that. And now, of course, it's not like instantly every single education worker in OPSU across the province walked out, but the threat of that forced school boards that were going to stay open because they don't have that many CUPE staff, right? Like, to close because, the people that do those jobs, do the CUPE jobs in that board were the OPSU people. So it's like, oh, geez, well, yeah, we can't run. So we're going to close too. And so you had at least 2 other school boards that were going to stay open have to close because of that threat. And so that was huge and gave, I think, confidence and inspiration to so many other unions to be like, holy cow, if OPSU is doing this, we better do something. And that's why I think that weekend, which I guess is that weekend, you had, I guess, what do you call it? The OFL executive board or something like that, whatever their highest decision-making group or whatever, come together and have emergency meetings. I think that were quite contentious around what should we do. And they eventually voted to let's have a political day of action strike or whatever, political day of action, a week from that Saturday into unlimited general strike afterwards. And all the whatever representative people voted on that. And then you had those people going, oh, geez, we better get out and start having emergency meetings with like, teachers and with all our different groups to see if we can make that happen, right? Because we've said it and we got to, let's see, are people on board? Let's go and talk to the members and get their feedback.
So, right, that's very helpful in terms of giving a sense of what was going on the weekend of the 6th and 7th of November. And I just want to underline, I think something that often gets lost after the fact when we look back on events like this, and that is just how fluid the situation was, right? And certainly I think what you've been describing speaks to that. It's not the only time this has happened, but in these kind of moments of struggle where large numbers of workers are moving into action, they're feeling their collective power, and particularly when they're defying the law. And so previous rules that seem to be just taken for granted or inevitable are being transgressed. There can be this real openness, right, and unpredictability about the situation, with things that people previously had not been willing to contemplate or that they thought was not possible, now being something that could be considered in terms of solidarity action, which is also law-defying, right, by other groups of workers to support this larger group of workers who have defied the law and gone on strike. So then we come to Monday, November the 8th. Can you talk about what happened on that day, which was obviously very important?
Yeah, for sure. That's one of those days where, like, of course, as just some rank and file guy, I'm watching it, and I felt a little bit, as like, I remember hearing that, like, because, this is, we're in this thing, right? Like, we're in this, and I feel a lot of, God, like, I want to win, and I can see, as a person who's deeply involved in this type of stuff and politics and all that type of stuff, I'm thinking, like, oh my God, like, we have to win this, or we have to come away with something here, right? And it's really nerve-wracking. And so I remember when someone called me that was familiar with this type of stuff and said, like, they're going to have, they're thinking about calling an unlimited general strike. I was like just weeping, because I was like, oh my God, we're actually going to do something, right? Like this, yes, like we're rising to the historic moment, like as a labor movement, you know what I mean? And so with that in mind, I'm like, okay, I couldn't wait till the press conference on Monday, right? Of course, just on the edge of your seat. And at this point, like, there's not much I can do. We're just sitting here. Like, I wasn't scheduled to work on Monday either. So I was just, hanging out, watching. I was, of course, at home with my kids, actually, who were not at school. And we were all, watching these results. And then you get the announcement that Ford is going to have a press conference ahead of time. And I'm like, oh goodness, what is this going to be, right? And for a second, when he had his press conference, it sounded like he was going to double down, right? And be really nasty, like the way because he was kind of like sneak dissing and like being kind of rude to the workers and stuff like that, getting in his usual digs. And I thought, oh my God, is he really going to double down? This is going to be disastrous for him, and also, like, this will light a fire, I think, under the whole movement. But of course, I guess, because those guys can sense the moment too. And from what I understand, there was a lot of dysfunction and disagreement within the caucus, the Tory caucus, around what to do, and people getting mad at this heavy-handed approach they'd taken, especially when they're trying to cultivate, good relationships with, some of these construction unions and stuff like that, and different unions like that. So they quite, astutely, I guess, stepped down and said, we will repeal this thing. We overstepped. Oh, geez. I just wanted to keep kids in school, all this, the usual stuff. And of course, doing that puts the whole other side, our side, in a weird position, right? Well, like, okay, well, that's rescinded, and saying that he would rescind it, and then kind of making the condition that I'll rescind it now. CUPE, you be cool and take down your strike, or you call off your strike or whatever. So of course, that is a real I don't know what's the word, like monkey wrench in the whole thing, where all of a sudden now it's like, okay, so what is it? Because the public, and you could see those polls that said 50% or more people support more unions joining in. 71% of the whatever the public say Ford is going too far and is bad and stuff like that. Okay, but now they're saying they're going to rescind the legislation, and that again it just makes it a bit more complicated, I think, for what to do next. Now, then you had this hour or so where everyone's like, ooh, and they were, the OSBCU people and stuff like that, and other representatives of different unions were, whatever, I'm sure, talking over all sorts of stuff, and then came back and, said, woo, this is a victory. And of course, it was a huge victory to be able to challenge that legislation, beat it, and have it stricken from the record, so the fines aren't even a thing, right? Like, that's the thing we have to remember, is that's like a very historic, huge thing, which hopefully we can talk about how historic it was a bit later. But then you did have the case where it's like, okay, well, we'll take down our lines and we'll go back to the bargaining table. And that's what happened there. Sorry, I guess, because for the record. And of course, then you had lots of people watching and going, "Oh, how do I feel about this? Geez, what happened?" You know what I mean? And so I guess that's kind of the Monday.
Yeah, and it was very dramatic. Interestingly, that article I mentioned by Martin Lukacs and Emma Paling, in it, they wrote, according to sources familiar with the conversation, that is a conversation that took place between Laura Walton and top CUPE officials. Walton felt cornered. It's also worth mentioning that the decision to end the strike was made by those leaders. There was no actual vote by the workers on the decision to fold the picket lines after the Monday and return to the classroom. So I think we should now take a step in a slightly different direction and talk about why things played out the way that they did, how we explain this. And you've talked a little bit about some of that, but if we want to, with hindsight, with some distance, answer that question of why things ended the way they did, how would you answer that question to start with?
Yeah, good. That is the question, right? Of course, because we can all be excited about all the different stuff, and we can also be disappointed. So it's interesting, right? Because this is a real study of contrasts. Because on the one hand, I remember feeling deflated for a second, and then thinking about how historic what was accomplished was, and so I just wanted to just think about what are the amazing things that happened. So like having Laura Walton go on TV and say to everybody, like, we are defying the strike, we'll pay for it, who cares, this is political, let's go. And then the whole province essentially rising to the challenge and bringing the threat of a general strike to the government is something that is so powerful and amazing. Because if we think about and I'm sure, and I know you've written about this in books and stuff, like we think about the deficits of the labor movement over the last long period, right? Like bringing back the language of solidarity, the feeling of, like the language and the idea of a general strike, to have it go from something that a few people will yell we should have a general strike every 2 weeks, but to have it something that was actually in play and actually possible based on the deep organizing and commitment and strength of this 55,000 group, 55,000 strong group of workers, again, who are predominantly women in this sort of this sort of caring what do you call it? Like caring economy? I don't know what, those type of jobs. That's pretty spectacular, to the point where it's like, you have all these construction unions that, in the past had supported Ford and stuff like that. Or, some of them had said, he's not so bad. Or, we're for this project. To have them come out and be like, ho, 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 you've gone too far. We are backing these education workers. We will walk off the job, all this type of stuff, based on an idea around like an attack on one is an attack on all. And this fight, an injury to this group will actually have an effect on all of us, and we can't let that stand. That's just so huge and amazing and powerful. And to defeat that legislation is such an accomplishment. And it was interesting too. I should just aside, because after the strike or the lines or whatever came down and people were back at work, I made a point to go into my job and make sure to thank every CUPE employee or what a CUPE represented worker in the building. And thank them for their bravery and the kind of, just to underscore the kind of importance of what they'd done. And it was amazing to hear those people. A lot of them, had conflicted opinions, but they all, for the most part, felt 10 feet tall. And I heard one person say, like, I just felt so powerful because this was a group of women that just stood up to this bully government and said, no, I don't think so. Like, it's not going to happen. Right. And they were feeling their power and feeling 10 feet tall. However, that's not every worker was feeling that exclusively, right? Many were frustrated, right? Thinking that when we had all this power, why did we take down the lines and give that up? And I think in hindsight, we can probably say that was probably a tactical mistake to have that government on the ropes and then and then sort of go back to business as usual when you had all this momentum may not have been the best plan. And maybe they, you can, obviously you're dreaming here where it's like, oh, they could have won everything and then some, you know what I mean? So I think in hindsight, we could say that. Why is it the case that, for instance, let's say both, let's say union leaders, like, those people that maybe that, in that article said, put pressure on Laura Walton to feel a certain way. Why wasn't it voted on by, the membership? Why couldn't we get a vote on the membership? Stuff like that. What's the root of that? Why isn't that the case? And I think part of it goes to what we were talking about, or what I was talking about a second ago, is that, a lot of this stuff is we're out of practice, right? We're talking about a labor movement that isn't as so familiar with the language of, with these big moments and this type of democracy and resistance and solidarity and stuff like that. And so it's the case that, it's the general strike and the fluidness of it means that, at one point we're relying kind of on, union leaders to call the general strike, but then we're in that same position that when it's time to call it off, it's like, oh, geez, those people still have, the power to do that, right? And so I think at its core, from my perspective, as a person who believes in rank and file unionism and all that type of stuff, we need to take this opportunity to build stronger, more political and, more, class conscious rank and file networks of unionists who can, who can help have these arguments about what should be done next, how to do it, can help, bring together different groups, different layers of workers, have that sort of, class-wide picture of what it means to win and resist. And I think if you have that or you have more of that, then there's less possibility that, a decision can be made without consulting all of the workers beforehand. And so I guess at root of why we are where we are, and there is an amount of disappointment to go along with the huge historic excitement. I'd say that's probably why, right? Like, we need to build stronger politics and connections within our unions and between other unions. I'd say probably.
And I really agree with the conclusion about that kind of the importance of that kind of independent organization of workers. And I think the ability of workers to, when necessary, act independently of the official union structures is really crucial, right? So having activists and who are organized before struggles break out, in a way with the kind of connections and respect that would make it possible to take independent initiatives when they feel that the people in the official leadership positions are taking the struggle in the wrong direction and not doing what needs to be done. That's something which I think we need to be working towards. It's obviously, in most unions today, we're very, very far away from being able to have that kind of organization. But I think that kind of rank and file organization is really crucial, precisely because in our unions, we have, at the top of these organizations, a layer of people who are full-time elected or appointed or hired people, whether they're elected officers or staff, who, as a group, because they're not actually doing the work that the majority of people in the union are doing, right? Their social conditions are different. Their interests are ultimately different as a layer of people, because they need the union as an institution to continue to operate in order for them to have their full-time positions. And so defending the union as an institution, including its bank accounts, becomes ultimately really paramount for them, regardless of what that might mean for the workers themselves. And so there are real pressures on people who occupy those positions to act in ways that will keep the union as a bureaucratic institution going, regardless of the, what kind of collective agreements people are working under, regardless of what conditions people have in the workplace. And so I think here we can look at the role of the CUPE national leadership in trying to put on the brakes, as in those terms. It wasn't because Mark Hancock, CUPE national president, as a person is particularly egregious or something like that. That rather it's people who occupy those positions in the top of the union officialdom have those distinctive interests. And it's interesting to note that, again, in this article that was in The Breach, it's reported that there was later on, after the strike in late November, a large meeting of CUPE, large number of staff and top officials meeting. And in that meeting, apparently Mark Hancock said, "I think what we did was motivate the workers too well," talking about the OSBCU strike. And the article goes on to say that then he was challenged from the floor by a CUPE staffer who'd worked with the education workers, who said, in fact, no, we need to be able to be a fighting labor movement. And there was massive applause for that person who'd spoken out, actually ultimately against their boss. And that tells us something about the way that the struggle of the OSBCU actually had an impact on staff, I think, inside CUPE. So it's interesting to see some of the tensions that were created there. Then ultimately, the OSBCU went back to the bargaining table and negotiated a collective agreement, which was ratified. Could you just summarize what you know about the settlement that they got at the bargaining table?
Yeah, and Laura Walton and others have talked a lot about it, and you can see, I get the way they expressed, both what was good about it and what was frustrating about it, and I think reflected, sort of like, oh, geez, we, that moment is gone, unfortunately. But I think it was huge for them to get, and I think lots of people are excited about getting a dollar raise. Like they said, like, we didn't want to go percentages. We're getting and every worker in that OSBCU got a $1 an hour raise, which is quite robust, especially considering what the government was offering. It sounds like they maintained paid sick leave stuff that they'd wanted, and the benefits funding, from what I understand. I could be wrong on that though. But they were very disappointed, I think, around job security language, which including things like having an ECE in every kindergarten classroom, and some other stuff around like replacing leaving workers and stuff like that, which just means that there'll be, which is the reality is that there is not going to be a guaranteed protection that, the services that students and schools need will be there in the future, right? And that was the drawback. And the government really seized on the fact that it's like, wait, you guys were just talking about money before. Now you want to talk about services? I don't get it. Like, you're happy with the dollar, but why are you talking about these services now? And so, it was the case where they sensed that I think the public was like, all right, we backed you last time and now we're good. Okay, let's get it going. Like, let's get back to normal. And of course, some workers were really excited about getting that dollar, or felt that they couldn't win more at that time. They were scared of potentially being like locked, goaded into another strike where the government didn't care and they just save money and hopefully they lose face in public. Like, these are the arguments I heard from different workers in the, that had voted on these things. And we're worried that the government was just going to go, oh, sure, yeah, go on strike like 2 weeks or 3 weeks before Christmas break. You're not going to get paid over break anyway. Many of you, depending on what job category you are, and we'll just wait you out, and then we'll save money, whatever. And so people were worried about that. It was offered to the membership, and they voted to keep it. And you could see, in these places where people are discussing this, tensions between, people that were like, gosh darn it, we could have had the world, or we can't settle for anything less than what we said we'd take, $3.25 an hour and stuff like that. And then you had tension between people that like, well, I think we did a good job and, we kicked some butt, and let's take this and let's keep building in the future. Right. And so those are arguments, I think, that I'm sure will be had within those spaces, and hopefully people will stay mobilized and organized to be able to build on this type of stuff. And we'll have to have those, have lots of different tough conversations about what we won, what we should have done, strategy, tactics, goals. How can we be better next time? Can we be stronger? Have those things within their union and hopefully build that stronger. Of course, the backdrop to that is that, the Tories do seem like, the conditions under which, those people are working are still going to be hard. And the reality is like Laura Walton and other representatives from OSBCU were saying, is like, well, you will have attrition when people can't make ends meet in these jobs, and people will be less likely to pick up, supply stuff like, supply EA jobs and things like that, and may look for other things. So those are the realities too, that again, the public needs to be aware of, that if we don't fund, education to the degree that we need to, it's not going to be as good as we need it to be. And so that's, I think, the reality going forward.
Yes. So when we look at what happened and assess it, I think, as you said earlier, there was a historic victory won by forcing the government to actually do a 180-degree turn and repeal this legislation that they had brought in, imposing a contract and invoking the notwithstanding clause in order to protect the legislation from any legal challenge. And so, there's certainly been other cases where, although it's not very common, there have been cases of workers defying legislation, to be able to defy legislation and actually force the repeal of the legislation. That was a historic win, even if then, unfortunately, what was negotiated in terms of the collective agreement wasn't that great. And so I think it is easy to forget when we look back at the situation, as I mentioned earlier, about how fluid things were and how there were all sorts of possibilities that workers could have tried to take advantage of. John Clarke, Toronto-based socialist who for many years was an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, wrote an article published on November the 13th in The Breach, in which he wrote, "If CUPE, with the full support of its allies, had responded to Ford's offer by informing him that there was no basis for calling off the strike, but that an offer that addressed its demands would be considered, the threat of a concessionary settlement would have been much less than it presently is. Moreover, the role of the education workers' struggle as a catalyst for broader united action in the face of the cost of living crisis would have been assured." Larry Savage, who teaches labor studies at Brock University, wrote that, or I guess was quoted in an article saying that the key question is what power and leverage at the bargaining table was potentially abandoned when the decision was made to take down the picket lines. And I'll just also mention that Sam Gindin, a former researcher with the Canadian Auto Workers, in an analysis of the strike, wrote that, and this was, I thought, an interesting idea, that the leaders of OSBCU could have responded to Ford's November the 8th press conference by saying that they would need some movement on the staffing question before they would end the strike and return to the bargaining table. Sorry, end the strike and return to the workplace. So given those kind of thoughts, do you have anything you'd like to add beyond what you've already said about what was possible, other tactics that might have been chosen and that kind of thing?
Oh, no. Well, I guess I've read all those articles and I definitely agree with all that. All of those things absolutely seem true to me, right? That, there's a lot more that could have been won, I think. And employing some of those things that they described, especially like what John Clarke said, could definitely, I think, have done some of that stuff, right? You could even imagine, I won't say too much, but like a whole, different change in what was going on in government based on some of that pressure, right? And those are things that unfortunately didn't happen. And so I do think, anticipating that, realizing the pressures that we're under, there's a few things that I think for those of us that are interested in those kind of results, that are very important to understand. Like, I think on one hand, it's like to lead is to foresee, right? And so if we want to be, we can, those of us that are, and it's great that we're having podcasts like this and articles like you've described, because we can assess what happened and anticipate what we need to do to go forward. We know that we need, as you mentioned, I thought you summed it up really well. We need stronger rank and file action that can take independent action of the leadership, or at least can force the leadership to be even more accountable to the members, right? Where there wouldn't have, it wouldn't have been a thought that you could make any of these decisions without the input of all the members. When we see these things on the horizon, we need to be making solidarity possible for everyone, right? Like making it, I think in the article I wrote something like easy and everywhere and very visible, right? There's something for everyone to do, even if we're not in that direct bargaining unit, and there's ways to plug into all that type of stuff. And I think that's what I've appreciated about, for instance, the Justice for Workers campaign, because people are like, well, I work, I'm one person that works at a cafeteria or whatever, like a food, what do you call it? Food court. I have a sense that, I'm into like, labor rights and stuff like that, but I don't know what to do. I don't have a union. What do I do? You can plug into this and you can meet people that are on that wavelength, people that can help you unionize, people that can help you plug into activity that will raise the conditions for everyone, like political demands on like, the what do you call that? The Employment Standards Act, stuff like that. There's stuff for all of us to do to be able to plug into that, get connected, and then build solidarity for others, knowing that we think that an injury to one is an injury to all. So let's help this group of workers win. Let's help these carpenters win, because that's going to have an effect on education workers. Let's help these education workers win, because that's going to help teachers, and so forth. Building that kind of culture and that kind of like political movement and network, I think is so important, because it'll have that effect, and it'll give confidence to people that leaders, like Laura Walton and stuff like that want to do the right thing. But, of course, might feel pressure in different regards, right? All kinds of different pressure that exist in our society. And so we want to give confidence to the best of them, to the best of our leaders to act in a great way. And we want to be able to act independently as workers, you know what I mean? Where you can, do the kinds of stuff that we know, that the kinds of stuff that like John Clarke and others have described can help us win in a really, really big, meaningful way. But I think finally, the thing that's really important about what John Clarke says, that, the thing he talked about, building this sort of wider sense of class power, it didn't happen to the degree that we wanted to, of course, but it did, it brought that stuff back to the table. And I think it was OPSU leader J.P. Hornick, hopefully I said their name right, that said at the press conference, they said, if you come for one of us, you come for all of us. And workers in this province will shut it down when we have to. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. And I thought that's pretty powerful for someone to say and to have that language out there, right? Because it is the case that we could potentially do that given the right circumstances. And the education that so many people in the province got, workers and people outside unions and all this type of stuff got, was something, hopefully more than once, but something that's sort of really special that doesn't come around all that time. And I think there'll be a whole generation of activists and people that are interested in this type of stuff that'll be able to study this moment. They'll have this moment as something to look at and be like, okay, what went right? What went wrong? How could we change it? What are we going to do next time? And so many people were drawn, and people in this union, right? Think about the people in the union. They had to be out there arguing with their family, with their coworkers, all this type of stuff, like in the OSBCU, about what they thought was right, politicizing themselves and becoming, again, a new generation of leaders in the union movement. And that's so important, right? They went through that experience, and I'm sure some of them are hurting and some of them are feeling great about it. And there's lots of mixed feelings, but they had this experience that they can learn from, and then, as I'm sure changed them in many ways to different degrees for different people. But those are people that can now be out there making arguments about what needs to be done next, what they do differently, and how they could change it. And they've been activated through this whole thing. As Laura Walton was saying, since 2019, that deep organizing that they're doing, getting people involved. And you can see, talking to different people from different locals, the kind of engagement and excitement and the feeling that they had of receiving solidarity from the public when, if you're an EA in a school, can feel kind of atomized, right? I'm just this one person. I follow around one student during the day and help them with their tasks. Sometimes I'm not in the mix, but all of a sudden it's wow, I'm really important, and everyone's talking about what I do, and what I do matters, and what I vote matters, and these arguments that I have are important. I think that's so huge for the future of the labor movement in Ontario, and hopefully we can generalize some of the best lessons and the things we want fixed for the future, because we want other people to learn from this too. And I appreciate just having this chat with you too, because I feel like I'm thinking about things, and I'll go back and think about things differently and talk to people and everybody about this and try and figure out what's next,
Well, thanks very much, because you've, I think, really spoken eloquently to the importance of the process of collective action, the process of struggle in how we change, right? Through that experience. There's nothing that can substitute for that transformative experience of mass struggle. That's a fundamental point that fundamental Marxist point, I think, that we need to be generalizing and sharing. And by talking about it today, we've given people hopefully a resource that they can use to educate themselves and discuss with other people, because we really do need to learn from these experiences of struggle when they happen, because, as you said, they are so precious and all too rare. So thanks very much for joining me on Victor's Children today.
Yeah, thanks. It was really fun. Appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.